Imagine a building. Not just any building, the greatest building the human mind had ever conceived. A place where the secrets of medicine, mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and poetry were stored under one roof. A place where the most brilliant thinkers of the ancient world walked through the same corridors, debated in the same halls, and read from the same shelves. A place that held, by some estimates, 500,000 individual scrolls, representing nearly everything the ancient world had ever written, thought, discovered, or imagined. Now imagine it is gone. Not misplaced, not moved to a safer location. Gone. Burned, scattered, destroyed, taking with it knowledge that we will never, ever recover. Ideas that may have changed the course of human civilization by 500 years. Answers to medical questions that people were still dying from centuries later. Mathematical proofs, astronomical discoveries, engineering blueprints, entire bodies of literature. All of it vanished. This is the story of the Library of Alexandria, the most ambitious intellectual project in the history of the ancient world. And the question that has haunted historians, scientists, and philosophers for over 2,000 years, what exactly did we lose? And could we have prevented it? The answer to that second question is yes, and that is what makes this story not just a tragedy of the past, but a warning for the present. To truly understand what Alexandria meant to the ancient world, you need to understand the world before it existed, a world where knowledge did not travel. For most of human history, ideas were fragile and local things. A physician in Athens had no reliable way of learning what a physician in Babylon had discovered a generation earlier. A mathematician in Persia had no access to the geometric breakthroughs being made simultaneously in Egypt. A poet in Rome had never read the great works written in Persian. Information moved only as fast as a person could walk or sail, and most of it never moved at all. It lived in the minds of individuals, passed down through apprenticeships and word of mouth, or scratched onto papyrus scrolls that could rot, burn, flood, or simply be forgotten when the person who owned them died. The Mediterranean world of the 4th century BC was, by any measure, extraordinarily creative. The Greeks had produced Plato, Aristotle, Thucydides, and Sophocles. The Persians had built an empire that stretched from Greece to India. The Egyptians had maintained a civilization for over 3,000 years, but all of this brilliance existed in isolated pockets, separated by language barriers, geographic distance, and political hostility. There was no common place, no shared repository, no way for the knowledge of one civilization to build on the knowledge of another. Then, in 331 BC, a 25-year-old Macedonian general swept through Egypt and saw something that no one else had seen. Potential. He looked at a strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Great Lake of Mareotis, a natural harbor where 3 continents could meet, where ships from Greece, Africa, and the East could all converge. And he made a decision that would reshape the intellectual history of humanity. He founded a city. He named it after himself. He called it Alexandria, possibly from a life of relentless campaigning in some of the harshest terrain on earth. His vast empire was divided among his generals, and Egypt went to a man named Ptolemy the Soter. Ptolemy was different from most of Alexander's other generals. Yes, he was a brilliant military commander. Yes, he was politically calculating and ruthless when he needed to be. But he was also educated, intellectually curious, and deeply aware of something that pure military conquest could not provide: legitimacy. He understood that to make Alexandria the greatest city in the world, not just the richest or the most militarily powerful, but genuinely the greatest, he needed to make it the smartest. Around 295 BC, inspired by his advisor Demetrius of Phalerum, a former student of Aristotle and the ex-governor of Athens, Ptolemy thus began construction of a remarkable complex called the Mouseion. The word means shrine of the Muses, the 9 goddesses of the arts and sciences. We know the concept today as a museum, but the Mouseion of Alexandria was unlike anything that had come before it. It was a fully funded research institution, a place where scholars were invited from across the known world, given free housing. At the heart of the Mouseion was the library, and its mission was stated with a boldness that still takes the breath away 2,300 years later. Collect every book in the world, not some books, not the important books, every book, in every language, from every civilization. The Ptolemies pursued this goal with the obsessive determination of people who genuinely believed they could achieve it. They sent agents and buyers across the Mediterranean, to Athens, to Pergamon, to Carthage, to Persia, to Babylon, with vast amounts of money and orders to purchase any scroll they could find. When merchant ships docked in the harbor of Alexandria, royal officials boarded them and demanded that any books on board be surrendered for inspection. The library kept the originals. Copies, sometimes hastily and imperfectly made, were returned to the ships. The owners had no choice. One of the most famous stories about the library involves the literary treasures of Athens. Ptolemy III borrowed the official state copies of the plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, the founding texts of Western theater, from Athens, depositing a colossal amount of silver as collateral and promising to return them. He had master copies made and then returned those copies to Athens, forfeiting the entire deposit without hesitation. He kept the originals. Athens was furious. Alexandria was richer. The collection grew with extraordinary speed. Scholars estimate that at its height, the library held between 400,000 and 700,000 individual scrolls. To put that in context, the largest library in Rome at its height held perhaps 20,000 scrolls. The Library of Alexandria was not just bigger, it was in a category of its own. It was the internet of the ancient world. And just like the internet, it attracted the most brilliant minds of the age. A man named Eratosthenes served as chief librarian of Alexandria around 240 BC. He was, by the standards of any era, a genius, a mathematician, geographer, astronomer, poet, and philosopher. And while working in Alexandria, with access to the library's vast collection of geographic texts, he accomplished something that should have been technically impossible for his time. He calculated the circumference of the Earth. His method was elegant. He knew from a scroll in the library that at noon on the summer solstice, on that same day at that same moment, a vertical stick cast a shadow at an angle of approximately 7 degrees from straight up. Since the Earth is a sphere, he reasoned, that angular difference represented approximately 1/50th of the full circle. If he could measure the distance between Alexandria and Syene, he could calculate the full circumference. He paid a man to walk the distance and count his steps. His final answer, approximately 40,000 kilometers. The actual circumference of the Earth is 40,075 kilometers. He was right. He calculated the size of our planet with a stick, a well, and a library. Euclid, the father of geometry, worked and taught in Alexandria. His masterwork, The Elements, 13 books laying out the complete logical foundations of plane and solid geometry, was written in Alexandria, and it remained the standard textbook for mathematics in schools and universities for more than 2,000 years. If you studied geometry in school, you studied what Euclid built in Alexandria. Archimedes, one of the greatest mathematicians and engineers in all of human history, visited Alexandria as a young man and studied in its library. The ideas about levers, pulleys, buoyancy, and mechanical advantage that he developed in Alexandria later became the foundations of physics and engineering that shaped the modern world, reportedly with the permission and support of the Ptolemaic rulers, distinguished between veins and arteries, described the structure of the eye, and recorded detailed observations about the liver, the pancreas, and the heart. Erasistratus came startlingly close to discovering the circulation of blood, a discovery that the European medical world would not formally make for another 1,800 years. When William Harvey described it in 1628, the knowledge was there, in Alexandria, and then it was gone. Perhaps most haunting of all is the story of Aristarchus of Samos. Working in the 3rd century BC, using the resources of the Alexandrian library, Aristarchus proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system. The idea that the Earth and the other planets orbit the Sun, not the other way around. He was completely correct. But the scientific establishment of his day, led by Aristotle's geocentric model and supported by common sense and religious tradition, dismissed him. His original works were lost. And 18 centuries passed before Nicholas Copernicus arrived at the same conclusion in 1543. Triggering the scientific revolution. Think about what that means. The heliocentric model, the foundation of modern astronomy, was known in Alexandria in 250 BC, lost. Rediscovered in 1543 AD. That is nearly 1,800 years of delay. 1,800 years, during which humanity navigated by incorrect astronomical models, made errors in calendars, and remained fundamentally confused about the structure of the solar system they lived in. Nothing this powerful, nothing this threatening to existing authority, could survive indefinitely without enemies, and the Library of Alexandria had no shortage of them. The first blow came from the most famous Roman of them all. In 48 BC, Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria, drawn into the complex political conflict between the young Queen Cleopatra VII and her brother Ptolemy X, who were fighting for control of Egypt. During the fighting around the harbor, a fire broke out on the docks. Ancient sources, including the Roman biographer Plutarch and the historian Livy, suggest that the fire spread to warehouses near the waterfront where books were stored, possibly awaiting shipment. Some ancient writers describe this as the destruction of the library itself. Most modern historians believe it was a secondary storage facility, a warehouse holding perhaps 40,000 scrolls, and not the main library building. But here is what is crucial to understand. The library survived Caesar's fire. It was damaged, perhaps significantly, but it continued to operate. Years later, Mark Antony reportedly gave Cleopatra 200,000 scrolls from the great Library of Pergamon as a gift to Alexandria, a deliberate replacement for books that had been lost, suggesting both that there had been real damage and that the institution was still functioning and worth restoring. The second major blow came in 270 AD, when the Roman Emperor Aurelian moved against a rebel faction that had taken control of Alexandria. His armies destroyed large sections of the city's royal quarter, the Brucheion district, where the library complex was believed to be located. How much of the collection survived is simply unknown. The historical record goes quiet here in a way that itself feels ominous. Then came the religious dimension. In 391 AD, the Christian Emperor Theodosius the Martyr issued an edict condemning pagan religious practices throughout the Roman Empire. The Bishop of Alexandria, Theophilus, used this as an opportunity to attack the Serapeum, the magnificent temple dedicated to the god Serapis, which also housed a secondary collection sometimes called the Daughter Library. A Christian mob, led by monks, stormed the Serapeum, tore down its statues, and burned or scattered whatever remained of the scrolls inside. Whether this represented a large portion of the original collection or a small remnant is still debated. Here is the uncomfortable truth that scholars have spent a century and a half slowly arriving at. The Library of Alexandria was not destroyed in a single catastrophic event. There was no one fire, no one knight, no one villain. The Library of Alexandria died slowly over the course of several centuries through a combination of fires, political disruption, and, most devastatingly, simple neglect. As the Roman Empire that controlled Egypt became increasingly unstable and cash-strapped in its later centuries, the generous funding that had kept the library alive simply dried up. Scholars stopped being invited. Acquisitions stopped. Maintenance was deferred. Scrolls degraded and were not replaced. The intellectual community that had made the library meaningful, the community of scholars who read, debated, copied, and taught, gradually dispersed to other centers as Alexandria itself lost power and prestige. The real turning point, the moment that actually killed the Library of Alexandria, was not a fire. It was a decision, a series of decisions, made by people who had the resources to preserve the greatest collection of human knowledge ever assembled, and chose to spend those resources on other things. We know some of what was there, because fragments survived as quotes embedded in other texts, as summaries written by later scholars who had briefly seen the originals, as tantalizing references in works that themselves barely survived. We know that Eratosthenes wrote a multi-volume geographical treatise called the Geographica, which included a world map of startling accuracy. Only fragments quoted by other authors survive. We know that Herophilus wrote at least 9 major works on anatomy and medicine, including detailed studies of the brain, the nervous system, and the reproductive system. Not one has survived. We know the historian Manetho wrote a comprehensive history of Egypt, going back thousands of years, which would have been invaluable. What survives are excerpts quoted in later works. We know that the ancient Greek theatrical tradition produced thousands of plays. The library is believed to have held complete works by Aeschylus, perhaps 90 plays, by Sophocles, by Prometheus, perhaps 120 plays, by Euripides, perhaps 92 plays. Of all of these, fewer than 40 total plays survive today. Fewer than 40 out of several hundred. What were those lost plays about? What ideas did they explore? What dramatic techniques did they develop that we have never seen? We will never know. Babylonian, Indian. Knowledge systems that had been developing for millennia, collected in one place for the first time, and then lost before anyone could fully read, copy, or transmit them. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries might have occurred 1,000 years earlier. The implications of that claim are staggering. It means we might have had germ theory of disease in the 6th century, modern astronomy in the 8th, the steam engine in the 10th, the antibiotics that would have saved hundreds of millions of lives across the medieval period, potentially available 5 centuries before the Black Death swept across Europe and killed 1/3 of the population. We will never know, and that, precisely, is the magnitude of what was lost. The Library of Alexandria is gone. It has been gone for a very long time, but its shadow stretches across everything we know and everything we are still trying to learn. The very concept of a public library, a place where knowledge is systematically collected, organized, cataloged, and made available to anyone who seeks it, was born in Alexandria. Every university library, every national archive, every public library in every city in the world today is the direct intellectual descendant of what Ptolemy the One built in Egypt in the 3rd century BC. The library also gave the world something less tangible, but perhaps even more important. The idea that knowledge itself has value beyond the individual who created it. That the accumulated wisdom of human civilization is worth preserving, not just for the people alive today, but for every generation that will come after. That we have a responsibility to the future. a genuine, serious, moral responsibility to record what we know, to protect what has been discovered, and to pass it on. In 2002, a remarkable building was opened near the ancient site of the library on the shores of the Mediterranean in Alexandria, Egypt. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina, the new Library of Alexandria, was designed in the shape of a tilted sun disk emerging from the earth. It holds millions of books in dozens of languages, houses research institutes and planetariums and art galleries, and serves as a conscious, deliberate, deeply symbolic attempt to resurrect what was lost. It is one of the most meaningful architectural statements of the 21st century, a civilization saying, "We remember what we lost, and we will not make the same mistake again." But perhaps the most important legacy of the Library of Alexandria is not a building or a concept. It is a warning about the fragility of knowledge, about how quickly the accumulated wisdom of centuries can be lost when the people who have the power to protect it choose to look away. The Library of Alexandria did not need to disappear. It had the resources to survive. It had the knowledge to last forever. What it lacked in the end was people who cared enough to make sure it did. Today, more human knowledge exists than at any point in history. It lives in data centers and cloud servers and digital archives, stored in formats that depend on infrastructure that could, in theory, fail. We are, in some ways, more vulnerable than Alexandria ever was. We have more to lose. The lesson of Alexandria is simple. Preservation is not automatic. It is a choice. And it has to be made, actively and deliberately, by every generation. The Library of Alexandria held the knowledge of the ancient world. And when it was gone, not in a single night, but over long, slow, preventable centuries, humanity spent generations painfully rediscovering what had already been known. Which brings me to a question I want you to think about and answer in the comments below. If you could recover just one lost work from the Library of Alexandria, one scroll, one book, one discovery, what would it be? Would you want the complete astronomical works of Aristarchus, the medical writings of Herophilus, the lost plays of Sophocles, the engineering manuals of ancient Egypt? Tell me below. I read every comment. If you made it this far, you already understand that history is not just the story of what happened. It is the story of what almost didn't survive. Next time, we are going to the civilization that picked up the scrolls of Alexandria when Rome was falling apart. The Islamic Golden Age scholars who preserved, translated, and expanded on ancient knowledge while Europe was in the dark. That is a story that almost nobody tells correctly, and it is coming very soon.